Hi, Yaabaa. So I'm going to read through your draft of your open letter to the Piscataway Board of Education. You'll have to tell me how to say that in class, and give you some feedback so that you can work on constructing your final draft for your portfolio on the 20th. Okay, so I normally recommend that people address their letters to individual people, although small boards and stuff are fine. Typically what you do in this situation to make it a little more personal is you would identify who the leader of this board is. I don't know how the board is organized. They may not have like a chairperson or a president or something. If they do, what you might want to say is like, Dear Jane Ramirez, comma, chairperson of Piscataway Board of Education and board members. So often in a situation like this, in order to give it a more personal touch so that the readers don't feel like you're just like addressing them blind, you would address it to the primary person and then to the other board members as a group. If there's a very small board, let's say 4 or 5 people, you could address it to Dear 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, comma, board members or members of Piscataway Board of Education, something like that, to give it a little bit more personal, more of a personal touch. There is a rise in youth suicide and a lack of urgency on your behalf. Youth suicide is a global epidemic, as reported by Forbes. The problem of youth suicide can be nixed at the root of the situation: youth depression. The National Institute of Mental Health estimates that up to 2.5% of children ages 5 to 12 suffer from depression, although the AACAP, American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, puts the number at double that amount. Additionally, according to an article published in the medical journal American Psychological Association, 90% of young children who commit suicide have some kind of mental health disorder, usually major depression. This number emphasizes how the lack of treatment of depression truly plays a large role in the suicide toll. Okay, good. So I'll say a few things here. First of all, you've done exactly what I've asked you to do in a body paragraph, which is to say that you have used evidence from multiple credible sources. National Institute, NIMH, the AACAP, and the APA are all credible sources. I don't know that I would describe, just to clarify, I would not describe the American Psychological Association journal as a medical journal, unless they do. I mean, I'm not super familiar with this, but the APA Psychological is not a medical organization. The American Psychiatric Organization, different middle word, is medical because psychiatrists have medical degrees and advanced training in mental health. Psychologists do not have medical degrees. Now, a psychiatrist can be part of the American Psychological Association, and the article can be written by medical doctors. But I don't know that I would describe the American Psychological Association's journal as a medical journal. I would just say in the journal. Now, it is an accredited, peer-reviewed, academic, professional journal. I'm not saying it's not a credible source, but it's a strong paragraph, so I need to give more like nuanced things. The other thing that I would say, there's 2 other things. One is that you start with a claim. There's a rise of youth suicide. I'm not a big fan grammatically. I know this is a first draft, but again, it's a strong paragraph, so I'll give you smaller detailed points. I'm not a big fan of starting sentences with there is. Feels like a violation of rhetorical grammar to me. When you're doing your final edits, try to have a specific subject rather than an empty subject verb pair like there is, it is, there are. Youth suicide is on the rise in America, right? More American youths are committing suicide every year. Wow. Now kids are the subject, right? Instead of it being an abstract, detached, third person, empty grammatical, there is, now all of a sudden you've got dead kids as the subject of your sentence. Certainly not a fun subject, but a rhetorically powerful one, right? Every year, more American children commit suicide. Boom. Youth suicide is a global epidemic, as reported by Forbes. The problem, okay. So the rest of this is, I think, quite strong. I don't know that words like nixed are good word choice-wise when you're writing to a board of education. I would definitely, given your audience, I would assume a more a more formal tone. I would also recommend, instead of saying this number emphasizes how, I would incorporate that into the previous sentence. It'll flow a little better. 96%, usually major depression, comma, emphasizing the lack of treatment of depression among, or the consequences of failing to treat depression among young people, something like that. That said, this is a very strong paragraph identifying the problem of the rise of youth suicide. Now you'll notice there's a part of this paragraph I haven't talked about and haven't outlined, which is this: lack of urgency on your behalf. You haven't established that. You don't talk about that at all. In fact, it would be obscene to suggest that one individual school board in New Jersey is responsible for the national problem. Will you talk about how the school board can and should do more? You will. But to make an argument against them, to attack the Piscataway Board of Education in a very serious way, and as you do in this half sentence, with no evidence or explanation, just makes it feel like a cheap shot. And if I read in the first sentence of your letter, and I'm a member of this Board of Education, that you're going to take a cheap shot at me, I've just turned my brain off. Unless I am morally or ethically required to read the rest of this letter, it's going in the garbage. I'm not going to read this anymore. Rhetorically, you have to be careful and think about your audience. So I would recommend a couple of things. One is I would completely remove this, and I would reframe your discussion of what the Piscataway Board of Education can do in positive terms, what they can do, how they can help the community, rather than trying to attack them. There may be value in shaming your audience, in calling them out. After all, this is in the end an open letter, not a closed letter, and maybe shaming the Board of Education for their lack of effort would be a good way to put pressure on them. But one sentence is not going to do it. And I certainly wouldn't introduce this until I was ready to actually talk about why the Board of Education has specifically failed. If you are simply saying they haven't done what they can, then say you can do more to address this problem, and then give them your proposals. This also reads like a first body paragraph to me, not an introduction. It gives me an overview of the rise of youth suicide, but I think it would be stronger to start with a good hook, something to get my attention, maybe like an anecdote that really illustrates youth suicide, and then give an overview of what the letter is going to propose. That said, I think minus this half sentence, this is an extremely strong body paragraph overall. Childhood depression is not only a leading cause for youth suicide, it also takes the form of misbehavior, excessive whining, extreme restlessness, irritability, stealing or lying, and poor grades, disrupting the classroom setting and impacting the learning of other children. Children who are depressed usually show symptoms of changes in sleep patterns or frequent stomach aches, poor grades, school phobia, social isolation, and antisocial behavior. And teachers should be trained well enough to recognize these symptoms in their students, help their students overcome this trial. Okay, so is this paragraph simply about outlining the fact that childhood depression is not only a leading cause of youth suicide, or is this paragraph about teacher training? I think if it's about the latter, you haven't done enough there. I think this last half a sentence should go, and this paragraph should just be about childhood depression. However, given the state of the draft, I think I would make a more advanced suggestion. I would actually save all of this background information for later, and I would actually rewrite this paragraph as a paragraph specifically about teacher training. Make your claim about teacher training by saying, right, childhood depression can be addressed by training teachers to identify the specific symptoms and signs, is the other word I'm looking for, the specific signs and symptoms of childhood depression. And then I would use all this material to explain that teachers can look for these things. Then I would give a concluding sentence about what teachers can then do once they've been trained to see these things, what they can do to respond to them. I think that the structure that I've recommended to a lot of students of give all the facts and then give a recommendation is a structure that works well but it is a more basic and less rhetorically powerful structure. Those recommendations are designed to make sure everyone completes a satisfactory open letter. This is your first draft. You will not have a trouble completing a satisfactory open letter. I think I would push you to try some somewhat more rhetorically more advanced strategies. And I think a more rhetorically advanced strategy is, rather than dump all of your evidence up front in background paragraphs, to use that background information as a way to kind of support your recommendations. You do a good job here by showing that this is a serious problem that I need to take seriously, but I think this paragraph could be used more effectively as a paragraph about teacher training. Good. This problem of classroom distraction shall never truly be eradicated. A study conducted by the Department of Education Institute of Education Sciences found that roughly 25% of an elementary school student's time in the classroom is spent distracted, not learning. Of the major problems that cause these children's attention span to wander, one of them was other children. Imagine if children without any type of mental illness can get distracted by other children, what it would be like for the children with depression. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I think that's valid. I assume you highlighted that because you're making a suppositional statement, one that is not supported, and therefore you're concerned that, can I back this up? Is it okay to say that? I think it is. I think backing it up is better. Moreover, I don't think it needs to be said. I think what you're trying to say in this paragraph, let me get to the end and then I'll talk about the paragraph as a whole. A study conducted to find the correlation between student testing and distractions concluded that students in a distracting situation perform less well on tests and students in a non-distracted environment. Could you give me more on that? I mean, that seems like one of those sentences where I read it and I go, duh. But what kind of gap are we talking here? 0.25% better? 0.5% better? In that case, I'm not jumping to think that distraction is a major problem. 50% better? What kind of impact are we talking here? One of the things is I think that skeptical readers are always cautious of blanket statements that say a study found that X is better than Y, when there's no specification of an effect size. How much worse or better? How big is this effect? How serious is this problem? These are the kinds of things I think readers are going to rightfully and understandably demand from a text. A study the distracted test. Piscataway is a top-rated school, and by attacking the problem of class disruptions, Piscataway can maintain and even improve their standardized test scores. Okay. I don't think you've done a good enough job of making a connection between the large amount of evidence you give here and addressing childhood depression. And I think this stems back, although I do like the concluding sentence, which I think does a good job of tying this information to Piscataway. I think the opening sentence is weak. This problem of classroom distraction shall never be truly eradicated. That feels like a true but rhetorically weak statement, right? You've just basically said to your reader, okay, now that I've given you all this information, let's give up because it's never going to be solved. I think what you're trying to say here is fighting childhood depression is a strong way to address the larger problem of distraction in schools. Yes, it'll never be eradicated, but there are two things that are true here. One is that it'll never be eradicated. Two is that fighting childhood depression is a way to take a positive step in the right direction on addressing this problem. Which of these two versions of that sentence, both of which are true, better serves your rhetorical interests? Which of these two makes it more likely that the school board and your other readers will rally behind your proposal? I would argue that saying fighting childhood depression helps everyone by reducing the problem of childhood distraction is a much more rhetorically powerful way to frame the content of this paragraph, right? So I would rewrite this claim to be a better transition from this paragraph, especially after you revise this paragraph to be more explicitly about teacher training. And then I would use this as both a positively framed step in the right direction sentence that also transitions from this. Once you do that, taken together, these two will be top-notch paragraphs. The problem of youth depression needs to be addressed. As the Board of Education for the Piscataway School District, the children in your school districts need to be informed of the topic of depression before the training you give in 8th grade. We see that depression affects, so I would give them credit for the training. By the way, this right here, boom, totally undermines your whole a lack of urgency on your behalf. As far as the Piscataway Board of Education is concerned, they give an 8th grade training, and that's what's needed. What you're saying, give them credit for that. Frame this positively. It's excellent that our local school system has an 8th grade training on depression. However, this training is not sufficient to address this serious problem, and children must be introduced to that beforehand. Give them credit for what they're already doing, but then point out the fact that this is not sufficient. We see that depression affects infants, toddlers, preschoolers, and school-age children. Don't use etc. in formal writing. Don't use etc. in any kind of rhetorically powerful writing. It sucks the rhetorical power right out of a sentence. If you have more to say it. If you don't, delete it. And yet the topic within the Piscataway School District is not brought up until 8th grade health class. Very good, strong, that's what I'm looking for, minus the etc. By the time these students finally arrive at 8th grade, when the lesson on suicide, depression, and mental illness is given, complete the thought. So I glanced down. I know that, so it feels like after these paragraphs it starts to get a little less complete, which is fine, it's a first draft. I was going to offer a criticism, but I'm going to read one more paragraph before I give you that constructive criticism, because I actually think the next paragraph is going to solve the problem, and it's just a matter of reordering. Children of all ages are affected by this mental illness, and not by teaching them about it, by not giving them background information on it, so they know what to look out for. They lack the preparation. We are sending children in schools and allowing them to face such harsh symptoms as anxiety, low self-esteem, lack of motivation at such a young age, because you do not want to implement such programs in a younger age. Okay. So I feel like these two are really one paragraph or one idea. And if you want to break them up into multiple paragraphs, this idea that children of all ages are affected by mental illness needs to come sooner, particularly because it repeats more or less exactly what you say here. And in neither case do you give any evidence for that. There is an implicit argument in your writing that the Piscataway School Board does not believe that children younger than 8th grade can experience depression. If you are trying to contradict that false belief, whether that's an explicit goal or an implicit goal, I certainly am seeing that. If you want to contradict that false belief, you need to give evidence for that. Because right now, the way it reads is, Yaabaa thinks this is true, and that's the only evidence being given. I would start off with that strong statement. It's good that you're doing it in 8th grade. However, that students need to be introduced to these concepts earlier. I would then insert somewhere in here, after the general sentence, either this one or some variation. I wouldn't give both because it's just repetitive. You need to give some evidence that young kids experience depression. Although you may have this may cover that. Yeah, you have some information here, but I would kind of reinforce that with at least one quote or one piece of evidence. Something to kind of remind the reader that this is true here. You also say, I'm sorry, I know you say what it is. I'm sorry, just give me 1 second, I'm going to find it. Because you do not want to implement such programs in the younger grades. So I have a question. Do you know that they don't? Can you give evidence that they don't? Your secondary readers would need that evidence. Or are you using as your only evidence the fact that they haven't done it? That doesn't mean they don't want to, and that doesn't mean that they're opposed to it. They may not know it's necessary. Again, attacking your audience, it can be powerful at the right moments, but attacking them in ways that feel unfair to your reader is not going to persuade them. It's going to turn them off. I would frame these two paragraphs more about earlier programs because it's necessary, because the evidence shows it needs to be done. So we'd have 2 paragraphs about teacher training and the benefits of teacher training. You'd have a background paragraph, an opening hook, and then 2 paragraphs about earlier access to education. And should you find the information appropriate to hear, then this will be a 3rd paragraph about earlier training programs. Or you could take these 3 and combine them into 2. I think that would be strong. 2 paragraphs making a positive argument here, 3 paragraphs making a positive argument here, background, intro, and then, well, let's take a look at the counter argument. Many naysayers would say, many naysayers would argue, and naysayers, okay, a little bit dated, but it's valid. Many naysayers would argue that implementing these programs in younger grade levels would pollute the minds of these kids. They would say that by telling the children these symptoms, they might act on them in hopes of getting attention. And although these are valid points, by not implementing these programs in younger grade levels, it leaves a large area of vulnerability for the children in the younger grades and leaves them feeling alone, because they do not know the options they have when feeling this way. These children do not know that it's normal to feel the way they do, and that there are healthy options and people they can turn to so that they can live a healthy and happy childhood. All right, I wouldn't include a separate paragraph with counterargument. I would integrate those concerns into your argument in favor of earlier education. The reason I would do that is it seems like the actual evidence you would need to back up these claims and the evidence you would need to back up these claims is the same. So I would simply talk about how educating children about the symptoms and signs and ways to address depression earlier has long-term positive health benefits, which you will have to give evidence for, despite fears to the contrary, or despite fears that this education might come too soon or something like that. You don't necessarily need to have a separate paragraph. If there were a counter argument that was distinct from the positive arguments, you would need a separate paragraph for it. Having a counter argument doesn't always mean having some generic schlocky paragraph at the end. It can also mean integrating potential counter ideas directly into your positive claims. Again, the more simple and obvious structure is to do it like this. But I think that you have a sophistication with your rhetoric that means that you don't need to do it that way. You can do it in a more sophisticated and subtle way. But I also think because the evidence in favor of this argument is the same as the evidence against this argument, you don't need to do it separately. I implore you, the Piscataway Board of Education, to do something to help stop this problem. No, you're imploring them to do 2 very specific, distinct things. All right? Don't back off. Hammer home your points. Don't back off into a generic statement. Fantastic, fantastic first draft, Yaabaa. Absolutely exceptional work. I read this as a truly model open letter in the making. Shoot for the moon with your structure and organization. Really try to hammer home these points and think about the rhetorical implications of your audience. You have such a strong first draft here. This is the potential to be a top-notch, guaranteed A final paper if you put in a little more time. Oh, and give me real citations, not URLs. Excellent work, Yaabaa. I'm extremely happy with this, and I'm really looking forward to the final draft. Fantastic work. Thank you.